Welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co-host Ludwig von B. Today we continue our journey through Bob Dylan's discography as we get to the 2012 album Tempest. To many, the title of this album will stand out because one will likely think of the Shakespeare play. However, when asked in an interview, Bob Dylan pointed out that that play was called The Tempest. This is just Tempest. And as far as I can tell, there is no similarity between the album and the play, but it's not a play I know particularly well either. So if anyone has any observations on that, feel free to let us know. This album opens with one of the catchier songs of modern Bob Dylan, and certainly the catchiest song on this album, a tune called Duquesne Whistle. And this is co-written by Dylan's occasional songwriting partner, Robert Hunter of the Grateful Dead. This is a song that has a nice thumping beat. It really gets its time in getting started, allows you to really appreciate its vintage mood. I don't know, it kind of has a Mickey Mouse, Steamboat Willie kind of feel to it. And then it has a great drop the bass moment as the song really started. I'm not sure I got much out of the lyrics of this one, other than understanding it in the context of a lot of the other songs Bob Dylan has written over the last 2 decades. Many of Bob Dylan's later songs are kind of cynical and talk about, falling in and out of love, a sense that no relationship will ever last. And Duquesne Whistle kind of repeats that theme, but it does so in a less dark and cynical way. It's more playful. It's more of a, here we go again. Life's a fun cycle. Let's hop on this train and maybe we'll get off again kind of thing. Then we get track number 2, which is called Soon After Midnight. This brings in a genre I don't know we've heard from before from Dylan, a kind of 50s, 60s, almost doo-wop-y thing to it. But as I've said before, no matter what the genre, 99% of the time, Bob Dylan will come in with very ambitious lyrics. And that makes for quite the unusual combination. Oftentimes doo-wop songs are straightforwardly optimistic in love or straightforwardly heartbroken. But this one is kind of in the middle. It's in a kind of, I'm going to have good love one day, but I'm not quite there yet. It's a far more nuanced mood than one is used to with this sound. Track number 3 is called Narrow Way. This is a straight up blues song, and like track 2 has that similar long-term optimistic perspective. The chorus goes, if I can't work up to you, you'll surely have to work down to me someday. Optimistic and also a bit cocky and threatening. This perception that the singer has both seems to come from a general belief that, everything regresses back to the mean. Maybe the singer's had a lot of bad luck, but that can't last forever. And also, there's potentially an observation there based on American history. America was once this little country whose presidential house got burned down by the British, and yet somehow this little country surpassed the world's long established superpower. So if America could do it, so could the singer. Track number 4 is called Long and Wasted Years. So as Bob Dylan's career has progressed, he's clearly moved in the direction of guy who outright just writes poems rather than writing songs with somewhat poetic lyrics. And when I first listened to this one, it really just felt there was some random music playing in the background while Bob Dylan was reading his poem over it. It didn't feel like a song at all. As I listened to it a bit more, I thought maybe it had the cadence of old talking blues songs, except it had more orchestral backing behind it. I don't know, maybe like you're at some fancy party, maybe on the Titanic or something, while reciting your talking blues. And the song is kind of fun just because Bob Dylan has a very playful tone on it. He sounds like the Joker that others and himself have called himself. The character he's singing as in the song first comes across as a cynical romantic partner. But as you listen more, it comes across more like a mischievous version of a Jiminy Cricket, someone whispering moral advice and scoldings into a person's ear before, realizing maybe they're too unreliable a voice to give that advice. For example, there's a part that goes, last night I heard you talk in your sleep, saying things you shouldn't say. Oh, baby, you might have to go to jail someday. Track number 5 is called Pay in Blood. This one is a nice, rich rock sound, and it sounds like it could be a Rolling Stones song. Mick Jagger could probably take this song to the next level. It's a playfully vicious tune, and I kind of understood it as maybe exploring the rationality of, some kind of mass shooter who puts out a manifesto, someone who might have little bits of valid concern in there, but then irrationally decides that they just have to turn violent themselves to make their point. Track number 6 is called Scarlet Town. As you can tell from the title, this is a grim depiction of a town. But the question is, what kind of town? You listen to some of the lyrics and maybe you think of a Western. Maybe you think of something even older, some pastoral village in England, because there's the reference to the character of Sweet Willie from the Old English folk song of Barbara Allen. One could also understand this as being about a modern American suburban town because there are references to streets named after trees, is the cliche in those kind of places. So I guess what I get from the song is that it's not really about one thing, it's just more about a mood, the idea of a town decaying, and that can mean many things in many different generations, but the feeling transcends time. Track number 7 is called Early Roman Kings. And if it was kind of implicit in track 6 that Dylan likes to talk about different historical moments to talk about timeless concepts, it's very apparent he's doing here because if you look at these lyrics, it really doesn't seem like he's talking about early Roman kings, especially from the Infidels album onward. Bob Dylan has written a lot of songs that target, big shots, uppity, egotistical people, politicians, businessmen, etc. And I have the sense from this song, a king is not literally a Roman king. It's anyone who has the ego, the arrogance, the willing to deceive for the sake of power that a king would. I read somewhere, and I'm not sure how well sourced, that this album might be inspired not by the Tempest, but by Julius Caesar. And that's certainly a significant point one can make in interpreting
Early Roman kings.
but it's ambiguous whether it's pro Caesar or anti Caesar. If it's a pro Caesar point, you can argue that while Caesar had the aesthetics of a monarch, he was still a populist at heart, and the true kings were the people who tried to overthrow him. But you could also, of course, interpret it as an anti Caesar song saying that whatever technical differences there were between people like Caesar and later Napoleon and the kings that came before them faded away as they ascended to their versions of the throne. Track number 8 is called Tin Angel. This is an intense Western song, and Bob Dylan has written many of these over the years. What stands out about this one is a jealousy revenge ballad. A man finds out that his wife has run away with another man. But what's interesting in the song is it's not just the two men fighting it out, but the wife gets involved in the fighting too. At first, she's not very kind to her husband, but then, when spoiler alert, her husband is killed, she changes her mind and is like, okay, I didn't like this guy, but you didn't have to kill him. And she becomes just as much of a Western badass as the two men in the song. So, the title song on here, the centerpiece, a song that goes on for 14 minutes, is called Tempest. This is a song many people are not going to like right away. I actually recognize the melody. I think it must be lifted from the old sea shanty Hanging Johnny, but it's a song about the sinking of the Titanic. And as I've said, Bob Dylan at this point in his career, he's not really a songwriter. He's pretty much just a poet who writes his poems over music. And I feel like a song like Tempest, you listen to it first and you're like, it's okay and it's impressive he can go on this long, but it's also kind of repetitive. You listen to a bit more and you're like, okay, the movie The Titanic already exists. What's the point of the song? Then you really spend some time looking at it and you can appreciate some of the individual choices in the verses. One of the named characters in this song is Leo, which feels like a weird choice because it's quite apparently a reference to Leonardo DiCaprio's character Jack Dawson from the Titanic, who's not a real historical figure. But I think what Dylan is observing is our understanding of history is shaped through media, and many people now know about the Titanic because of the movie, and Jack and Rose might as well be historical figures. Albeit he doesn't mention Rose and he doesn't call the character Jack, he calls him Leo. So he sort of continues the game of historical broken telephone. And I actually noticed that in other contexts this year. There were two animated movies, Puss in Boots, The Last Wish, and the Guillermo del Toro adaptation of Pinocchio. And both of them had characters who were basically Jiminy Cricket, which is interesting because the original Pinocchio novel does not have a character named Jiminy Cricket. It has a fairly minor character called the Talking Cricket, but these two films incorporated the character of Jiminy Cricket into their stories because Disney had essentially made Jiminy Cricket part of the Pinocchio canon. And yeah, long-winded, but Bob Dylan has clearly decided the character of Jack Dawson / Leonardo DiCaprio is part of the Titanic canon. Some other interesting things here. There's a lot of apocalyptic imagery, which I guess shows the influence that Bob Dylan's Christian period has continued to have on him. He's, I guess, trying to imagine how horrifying the apocalyptic scenes from the Bible are. And one way to imagine that literally is the scenes on the Titanic. And one God as an actor of justice interpretation, you could say, is this was a punishment for the decadence and arrogance of the rich who imposed this horrible class system on the Titanic. But this also speaks to the disproportionate nature of divine wrath, because in order to take down the rich, God ends up drowning all the Leos on the ship as well. There's also a repeated verse in which a character dreams about the Titanic sinking. And I just thought this was a cool little visual. It's Dylan sort of saying, with these catastrophes, you can only imagine they could happen until they do actually happen. So there's this one character on the sinking ship who's thinks of the ship sinking as something that could only happen in his dreams. The album ends with another interesting song called Roll On John. This song, it's quite apparent it's about the death of John Lennon. And I read somewhere someone dismissing this as kind of cliched. And look, there are plenty of people who paid tributes to John Lennon, and there are parts of the song that are just straight up Beatle lore. But one has to remember that Bob Dylan will never do something that straightforward and that's literal. You know, he threw in a weird reference to Alicia Keys in a long blues song. He inserted Leonardo DiCaprio into his historical song about the Titanic. And the character in Roll On John is both literally John Lennon, but a sort of broad, mythic, roving seaman kind of figure. Bob Dylan plays with the fact that John Lennon was in a band called the Quarrymen to refer to working in a quarry. And, you know, who knows whether this is just his grandiose interpretation of what John Lennon was like, whether saw John Lennon's moving from Liverpool to the United States as like a true pilgrimage. It had some deep meaning like that in John Lennon's soul, or Bob Dylan is just using the idea of a modern musical hero as a starting point to jump back to legends of old that he likes to tell. Who knows? But it makes for an interesting combination. So overall, there's certainly a lot that's interesting on the lyrical side with Tempest. As I said, this is the point in Bob Dylan's career where he's basically just a poet, but I guess he's decided he doesn't want to outright go to poetry, so he still records some music behind these songs. Duquesne Whistle, I think, really works as a musical song, and some of these others you could come to like musically too. I guess Pay in Blood, especially. But overall, interesting work. Probably not a Dylan album I'll fall back on much because, yeah, it's not incredibly fun to bop your head to, but certainly plenty to talk about. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.